Okay, we are in Screencast chapters 1, 2, and 3, part 5. Okay, we left off talking and... Okay, sorry if this sounds a little funny. I hit something, so we might have a little go back and bleep. So, we were asking the question of why were the cave paintings made? Lots of speculation about this. Is it like why we decorate our walls inside of our home for aesthetic appeal? No, probably not. But they were grasping the world around them. And what was it that they were concerned with in the world? Remember, that survival of the fittest. So they were drawing things on the walls that dealt with hunting and things like that. So what were the materials that the cavemen used to draw on the walls? Well, they couldn't go down to their local Hobby Lobby and pick up some art supplies. So they were using the things that were around them. So this is kind of a student kind of makeup of like what kind of the tools were that they would have used. So they could have used dirt, they could have used blood, they could have used berries, they could have used the fat from the animals that they caught and made up their own paint mixing with, let's say, materials or minerals that they had around them. So like that yellow, maybe ground up minerals like citrine, and lapis comes from a blue stone, so grinding that up. How would they have applied it? They, of course, use sticks, their fingers. They've got some makeshift kind of brushes there from sticks and some fur from the animals that they would have caught. The feathers, of course, that's kind of a faux painting technique, using a feather, but the blowpipe. So they had these materials to use, just things that were found in nature. Now, the Venus of Willendorf. This is a very famous sculpture, and usually it is not represented in, let's say, Hollywood to the scale that it actually is. Now, when we look at this, she does look like a very large woman. Remember, survival of the fittest kind of times. So when we look at this woman, I mean, those breasts could feed an army. So a tiny woman, we think of maybe not surviving in childbirth, but she looks like she could have some babies, right? And we're talking, this came from around 23,000 BCE. And why I said the scale is important is because if you look in your text and her scale is about 4 inches, maybe a little under 4 inches. Does that have any significance? Well, sure it does, because if we think about, let's say, I take a picture of my loved ones with me somewhere, or I have pictures of my loved ones on my phone and I take it with me when I'm not with them. That's what we kind of think that maybe this possibly was. It was a small little version that the hunter would go out for a long trip to find the food, but would want to remember his lovely spouse or wife back home, and this could have been kind of reminiscent of that. He could have taken her with him. But again, this is how Hollywood has represented her. This is a scene from Hellboy 2 when they were at an art auction with the tooth fairies. Maybe you remember that scene. So the scale, when we look at her, I always say she looks like the little booby doll, but she was like about 4 inches. But when we see this, definitely scale wise, she has more significance. We think of it as maybe that fertility type of idol. Okay, now Stonehenge. Stonehenge is, I'm sure, something that you have all broached that subject at some point in your education. So if you look on page 6, figure 1-4 in your text, you will find an image of Stonehenge. So what we're looking at is large megaliths from the Neolithic era around 2000 to 1500 BC. And what we're looking at, these are put into a round circular shape. And at looking at this particular image, the aerial shot shows you, you used to be able to go up to the stones, but it became an issue. Now we know a lot more about how to handle art and things like that. Something for me to let you know is that you don't touch the art. We have oils and dirt and all kinds of things on our hands, so we shouldn't go up and touch things all the time. And this is one of those things. Now they've got that path there where most visitors stay on the path. There are some who have like their own little guided tour that will get more of a closer up look, but still the basics there. Now, there's lots of ideas of why this was made. One of the fun ones, of course, I think is always funny to hear aliens, right? You know, who built the pyramids? Who built Stonehenge? It was aliens. I had a guy from Greece one time in class who's like, yes, it's aliens. And so, but there are different ideas. This may be some sort of calendar, some sort of solstice predictor, something along those lines. But it definitely has this kind of, it's going to have a ritual happening, right? So who are the people who made this? That was one of the things that we think about. And when we look at this, these stones were actually brought to this site from miles away. So how did they get them there? And it would have taken generations to actually create this. We're also looking at, and it's been kind of a recent discovery, is this is a burial site. There are hundreds of people who were buried here. And what we think of is that was probably the people who actually created and made it, those generations of people who made this structure. So when we look at this, we're looking at some very interesting post and lintel construction, which is the very first beginning idea of architecture. So we have the two posts that are standing up with that cross beam going across. That's the basic beginnings of architecture. So that whole why was Stonehenge built? We already answered that question. Now, fine arts. I've mentioned this before. Fine arts versus, let's say, a crafter or a hobbyer or something along those lines. Fine arts is something that we think of that is maybe doesn't necessarily have that utilitarian function, but it's more for pleasure. Okay, so different types of art. I usually think of folk art as something that would be something simple, something that a non-academically trained artist would create. Does that make it any less than what fine art is? No. A lot of times this can be things that are passed down from generation to generation, and that kind of task has been given to the next generation. Quilting would be a good example of this. If you've ever had a grandma who makes quilts, the art of quilt making is a narrative. It's a story. It's taking bits and pieces of fabric and putting them into patterns that tell a story about someone's life. So this is a piece that we consider to be folk art. It's found on page 25, figure 2.8 in your text. And the artist was a janitor, and it was not discovered until after his death. So the interesting thing about this piece is, and if you look at it in your text, you'll see a color image of it, but the materials that are used, that is something also that is an indicator of fine art versus something that is not fine art. So this is craft paper, cardboard, wood, aluminum foil, crafting type of materials. But look at how great that looks. It does look like a fine art piece. Okay, so also some of the goes along with folk art, some other names, outsider art, naive art, those kinds of situations, we all call them the same thing. Now, who uses art? This is one of those listings: the artist, the patron, and the observer. Now, who is the artist? When we look at that, that's the person who actually creates and makes the art. The patron is the person who either commissions or buys the art, and the observer is everyone else. So we are all observers, but there's only the artist and the patron. Those are kind of off onto their own. Okay, now what does the artist do? The artist fulfills basic functions in society. So when we think about artists, I always think, because I'm a sci-fi nerd, you know, those movies that are apocalyptic movies, we always want to save the artist, save the art. I always find that funny, but yet nobody really values art until it's like no longer available. Okay, so this particular art here, we're looking at the goddess Shiva, the lord of the dance. So what the artist has done here is give tangible form to the unknown. So things that we don't necessarily know what they look like, that's what the artist here has done as a function in society. This is one of those that when we look at it, the first thing I want you to do is say, what do you think that this is? And I usually get all kinds of answers as to what it is. Sometimes people look at it and see the back of a man and, you know, looking at this. This is actually a bell pepper done in a black and white photograph. So what the artist has done is the artist has taken an everyday object and kind of made us look at it in a new and interesting way. This is Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. You might be familiar with this. This is probably one of his most famous pieces. And with this is basically kind of taking an idea and giving tangible form to those feelings and ideas. Now, Vincent van Gogh is one of those iconic names and artists that we know. And one of the things that I find really interesting about Van Gogh is that in Van Gogh's lifetime, he never sold a piece of artwork. Now, what you should know is his brother was also an artist. And that's actually how he became an artist, because his brother worked and basically paid for Vincent to be able to create and make his artwork. They thought that being an artist was a noble calling. And, you know, he oftentimes wrote to his brother saying, you know, I'm sorry that I can't sell anything, and that someday people will appreciate it. And they did. It wasn't until his death that one of his paintings sold for $82.5 million. And that just goes to show it's really kind of sad that we kind of, you know, don't value things until we no longer have them. Now, this is a Kent cloth. And the Kent cloth is really one of those kind of functions where when we look at this, it's creating extraordinary versions of ordinary things. A Kent cloth is a type of textile that has hundreds of patterns, which is each of the patterns is known for owning basically a name, a history, a symbolism to that pattern. So it's a great function for artists to create and give something special and extra there. Now, this is a really good example of taking, like I said, those kind of everyday things and making them into something that is extraordinary, which is a lot of times what artists do. Refresh our vision and help us to see the world in new ways. And I'm going to stop at creativity, and we will do our next section beginning with creativity.